This presentation is brought to you by California State Parks Off-Highway Motor Vehicle Recreation Division. It is intended for educational purposes only, and the content is subject to change. Applicants and grantees must consult the regulations related to their project year. Please contact your grant administrator if you have any questions. Contact info can be found at ohv.parks.ca.gov by clicking Grants at the top of the page and then Grants Contacts in the submenu. You can also email the grants team at ohv.grants@parks.ca.gov. In this session, we will be focusing on the Habitat Management Program, otherwise known as the HMP. I would now like to introduce John O'Brien, who is the Environmental Program Manager. Take it away, John.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Welcome to the Habitat Management Program workshop. My name is John O'Brien. I'm the manager of the Environmental Compliance Unit of the California State Parks OHMBR Division. Today, my colleagues will be presenting on the Habitat Management Program for the Grants and Cooperative Agreement Program. A few logistics: we have a five-hour interactive presentation for you today, providing plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. We'll have a 45-minute lunch around noon, with breaks intermittently throughout the workshop. We gave ourselves plenty of time for open discussion, but we may finish early. Before we start, I know there's been a lot of discussion in recent months related to the Habitat Management Program and updates to those programs to make the HMPs as robust as possible. In an effort to make the requirements of the HMPs as clear as possible, and in the hopes of making the development of the HMPs as seamless as possible, staff will be walking you through the necessary steps to complete a HMP today. And if there are questions as you move forward beyond today's workshop, know that you can reach out to these staff. They're very knowledgeable and are here to help in any way they can. Next slide, please. This presentation will be a group effort with Karen Feldheim, Michelle Ma, and Shane Emerson presenting for California State Parks, and Megan Kalenkar and Paula Hartman presenting from MIG. Karen, Michelle, and Shane are environmental scientists with State Parks. Megan is a senior biologist and Paula the principal for MIG. MIG is a firm that has been working closely with parks on the HMPs for many years now. Next slide, please. So a note on the agenda: Karen and Megan will be giving an overview of the HMPs, and then Karen will be discussing HMP Part 1. Megan, Paula, Michelle, and Shane will then be presenting on HMP Part 2 and the HMP reporting at closeout, project closeout. Again, in terms of breaks, we'll be playing that by ear, but most likely at least take a short one once an hour or so, with a 45-minute lunch around noon. With that, welcome again to the workshop. Thank you for attending. We can go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Karen and Megan.
Hello, my name is Megan Kalenkar. I'm with MIG. I will be presenting a little more in detail later, but just want to give you a brief update to the HMP updates that are in the pipeline. As many of you may be aware, the division has been working on updates to the HMP for the past year and a half or so. We had a feedback session from grantees on the proposed updates last September. It's since undergone a round of public review and comments, and the revisions will go into effect January 1st, 2025. So it's going to be a couple of grant cycles before this actually goes into effect, and it'll be both some updates to some definitions and regulations, as well as to the HMP form itself. It's most importantly, everything that you learned today is still going to be relevant to the HMP. These are not dramatic changes or a complete reworking of the HMP process or program. So again, everything's still going to be relevant moving forward. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it over to Karen.
All right, thank you, Megan. Next slide, please. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Karen Feldheim, and I'm one of the ESs at OHV headquarters. I've had the privilege of working with many of you throughout the year. So let's get on the trail with the Habitat Management Program, or the HMP as most of us call it. Many of you have worked with the Grants and Cooperative Agreements Program for many years, very familiar with the HMP, and some of you may be new this year. So in that case, welcome. Next slide, please. Okay, according to the Public Resources Code, this is our basic requirements for the program are in the PRC and the supporting regulations. According to the PRC 5090.53, all grants and cooperative agreements involving ground disturbing activities shall be subject to the uniform application of soil and wildlife habitat protection standards. So the uniform standard that has been developed in this case for the wildlife habitat protection is the HMP. Next slide, please. All right, so who must prepare an HMP? According to the California Code of Regulations, all applicants You're not seeing the slides, huh? Let's see what we can do here.
I'm seeing the slides on my end, so it might be just a connection issue with that particular individual.
Okay. All right. Everybody else seems okay? I'm going to continue on then. Okay. But thank you for just jumping in the chat and letting us know. All right. So back to who must prepare an HMP. According to the regulations, all applicants submitting a proposed project involving ground disturbing activities shall address the HMP requirements. Applicants submit one HMP for the entire application, encompassing all project areas for every project with ground disturbing activities. So you would have one application, but you might have a couple of projects within that application. You might have a safety and education grant. You might have ground operations. Some applications have 4 projects in them. They will all end up having one HMP covering the projects that have ground disturbing activities. When submitting a phase 2 project, the HMP must be addressed within phase 2. Next slide, please. But what is a ground disturbing activity? According to the regulations again, that defines the ground disturbing activity to be any earth moving project related activity. It often includes the use of heavy equipment. It typically includes such things as grading land, installation of culverts, hardening streams, large kiosks, and removal of trees if large equipment is used. There are a few specific activities that are not defined in the regulations that are considered to be ground disturbing. So these are not considered to be ground disturbing activities. Those being installation, replacement of signs, placement of boulders, most maintenance or replacement of existing fence lines, and sweeping in sand or dirt from paved roads. Next slide, please. And what is the project area? So according to the regulations, it defines the project area as the physical boundaries within which the activities will be performed and deliverables will be accomplished as described in the project agreement. This typically encompasses the OHV trail system and associated facilities, including perhaps staging areas, campground, picnic areas. The HMP applies to all project deliverables, including the match activities, and that's important to remember as well. Next slide, please. The HMP must consider both the funded project activities and the use directly facilitated by those activities, such as both the trail maintenance and the OHV use on all parts of the trail being maintained with the OHV funds, maintenance and use of a staging area, maintenance and use of open areas, as well as perhaps a new development and then the future use within that project, the developed area. Next slide, please.
Hey, Karen, there's a quick question that came through in the chat. Is cleaning a culvert by hand considered ground disturbing?
Is it okay if I just finish my part and then I can answer questions at the end? Would that be all right?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, I'll keep my mind going on the presentation real quick. Thank you, though. But thanks for the questions as well. So I'm going to jump into now the HMP Part 1. Most of you, if not all, submitted a preliminary application in the beginning of March. So you're already completed your HMP Part 1, and you're very familiar with this. So I'm just going to cover this briefly, and then we'll jump into the HMP Part 2, which is really the teeth of the habitat management program. Next slide, please. Okay, so the HMP Part 1, the first step in Part 1 is determining if the project includes ground disturbing activities. So we say here, all applicants submitting projects involving ground disturbing activities are subject to HMP requirements. So the projects include the match activities as well. So we've got to keep that in mind always. If the project, and then we need to know if so, the first step is, do any of the proposed projects involve ground disturbing activities? So that's the first part of it. If it's no, then you are finished with the hemp at that time. And then the OHV, State Park staff and MIG staff, we then review for compliance. Next slide, please. So if you do state that, yes, your project has ground disturbing activities, the second question is, this is kind of lengthy, can the applicant certify that none of the proposed projects with ground disturbing activities, including the OHV recreation facilitated by those activities, contain any risk factors to special status species and or sensitive habitats? So can you certify that none of your activities have any risk factors to special status species and or the habitats? And if you're saying yes, we can certify that, then you continue on to item 2. If you cannot, and you mark no, that you cannot certify that there are no risk factors, that's when you would be finished for Part 1, and you would then continue on to Part 2 and provide that in the final application. So a tip for Part 1 success: assess the potential for risk factors before the implementation of management, monitoring, mitigation, avoidance measures, BMPs, etc. So the point for that is to make sure that if you need to avoid a sensitive habitat or a species, if you know ahead of time you're going to need to avoid that, if you're going to need to mitigate, then you're stating right there that you know that there's going to be risk factors, and then therefore you cannot certify there's no risk factors. You will need to provide an HMP Part 2. Next slide, please. So for the next few slides, I just took these examples from the preliminary application. There's really 3 scenarios that you may have come up with Part 1. So the first one being, does your project even have any ground disturbing activities? And if you stated no, then you're finished at that time with the HMP, and State Park staff then will review the preliminary application for compliance. The second scenario would be, next slide, please. The second scenario would be, does your project have any ground disturbing activities? And in that case, you're saying, yes, we know that there's ground disturbing activities. And then also, can the applicant certify there are no risk factors to special status species or sensitive habitats? And if you state no here, again, as I was saying, you would then go on to providing a hemp Part 2 in the final application. And then the third scenario, next slide, please, would be, yes, our projects have ground disturbing activities. And yes, we believe that we can certify there are no risk factors to special status species and or sensitive habitats. And if that's the case where you're saying yes and yes, then that's where you would end up working on item 2, which is where, oh, next slide, please. Which is where you would provide the research and justification used to certify that the proposed project does not contain any risk factors. This one I'm going to get a little lengthy on, but I'm going to give some examples here. So the way you would perhaps provide the research and justification, and maybe with the use of species and habitat databases, such as the many of you federal employees are familiar with the IPAC or the CNDDB, as well as the NWI, the National Wetlands Inventory. With item 2, it's really important to provide this justification to show us how you believe there are no risk factors. So here are a few examples that I thought were useful. Some strong examples for justification, and then one that's inadequate. So one example of a strong justification would be: the project's ground disturbing activities are limited to maintenance along 1.26 miles of OHV trail. Recreation and biological resources staff have worked together to ensure there are no risk factors, such as adverse effects to special status species and/or sensitive habitats. According to the National Wetlands Inventory and site-specific surveys, the project is not in or near a wetland or stream. An IPAC report was queried and is attached. So it's always important too, you could sit there and let us know that you have done a search of the IPAC or CNDDB, but please provide the report as well. The only species in the IPAC report was the monarch butterfly, which the local biologist said was extremely unlikely to be impacted by the project. So that's one example of a strong justification, and provides the research of how you came up with that conclusion. Another one may be: the project areas are entirely in developed OHV facilities. Land cover and vegetation types include disturbed areas and or non-native vegetation. There are no wetlands present in the NWI for either of the sites. There are no known special status species occurrences detected on the project sites based on the biological report provided. Also, there are no positive occurrences known to occur at the sites based on a search of the CNDDB and IPAC. No critical habitat is known to occur on either of the OHV sites. So those are two examples of strong justification answers. And then one inadequate justification answer may be: proposed project activities are routine in nature and are within OHV trails, existing OHV trails and facilities. Avoidance measures will be utilized to avoid impacts to special status species and sensitive habitats. So in the strong examples, a thorough explanation is provided for why there are no risk factors to special status species and sensitive habitats by describing the project areas, the species and/or habitats present or known to be absent, and referencing reliable sources utilized, such as the NWI, the IPAC, or the CNDDB, and a site-specific biological report. And then the inadequate response, the justification of the project activities being within existing OHV trails and facilities, is faulty, as risk factors can exist near existing trails and facilities. For example, a special status plant population or a special status bird nest can be present adjacent to an existing OHV trail or facility. The inadequate response also relies on avoidance measures to prevent impacts to special status species and/or sensitive habitats. But risk factors should be assessed before the implementation of any type of mitigation, avoidance, or BMPs. So as always, feel free to reach out to us as well if you have questions regarding item 2. But as I said, all of you have already turned it into the preliminary applications. And if we haven't contacted you as far as a clarification email or a memo, then sounds like all is going well with that. So in summary of the HMP Part 1, all applicants requesting funds for conducting a project with ground disturbing activities must submit a Part 1, questions 1 and 2. If HEMP Part 1 certifies there are no risk factors, be certain that this is the case and confirm with supporting documentation in item 2. And then, as I just touched on in the previous slides, we have received your preliminary applications. They've been reviewed by State Park staff and MIG staff. So when and why might you be hearing from us regarding your HEMP Part 1? You might have heard from us. We might have contacted you regarding questions regarding ground disturbing activities, such as vertical mulching or a kiosk. If a CNDDB search was conducted, we may be requesting the report, or we may have requested the project specific location information. I've sent out a few clarification emails. It's been really great to discuss the projects with that. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I realized I haven't had you advancing the slides, so please excuse me as I've been reading my notes. Yep, I'm sorry, I messed up with that, with telling you, Amanda. Yeah, thank you. So if I kind of got off track a little bit there with my speech, let me know. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm here to answer them. If I'm not able to, I have wonderful coworkers on here with me. I guess we can start with the chat or raised hands, right? Debbie, we'll start. If anybody has a question, they can raise their hand. If not, I will look over at the chat.
Karen, we just had that question earlier that I had asked you about the ground. That was if cleaning a culvert by hand is considered ground disturbing.
Okay, I think this is a good example. I'll do the best I can to answer this, and Paula, Megan, Shane, somebody can jump on if they'd like to. I think this is a good example of what is there, you know. So is it, let's see, is it a ground disturbing activity? It depends on kind of what you're doing it by hand. Feel free to jump in, you guys. I would say here, it depends on what is there. So if you're doing it by hand, you're not using heavy equipment. We look at the sensitivity of the nature. Are there T&E species there? Is it a sensitive habitat? But by doing it by hand with like maybe rakes or a shovel, are we considering a ground disturbing activity? I would say yes. But Paula, would you like to add to this?
Well, you know, unfortunately, this is one of those, it's a great question because it's one of those scenarios where I believe it would require some discussion with the grants staff, because it depends really on what you mean by clearing a culvert. Are you simply clearing out some clogged vegetation, for example? Are you moving earth? I mean, you know, the Public Resources Code is, the trigger is whether it's ground disturbing. So that's a big part of it. Karen, you know, you were absolutely right. What kind of equipment? Here it's saying, you know, hand ground disturbing. Of course, you can take shovels, you can do all that by hand and move a lot of ground, right? So really, if you have a question like this, it's something that we would need to discuss with you. You know, give us the specifics of what you're proposing to do and how you're proposing to do it, and then could determine whether those activities are ground disturbing or not. But it really is partly it's a matter of scale, and it's a matter of what exactly you are moving when you describe clearing a culvert.
Thank you. I saw Shane pop up here. Shane, did you have something to add?
Paula beat me to it.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks. That's what I like about this is we've got a whole team here to work with you all, and we're really hoping that the workshop today is interactive. You have questions, you have comments. That's really great. You know, I already realized I missed a couple of slides. I forgot to tell Amanda to advance them, so I'm over here talking away with my notes, realizing. And I'm sorry that they weren't on here. So feel free to reach out to me if I wasn't clear with some of mine. I'm happy to work with you just one-on-one too, if you have any questions regarding my part of the talk. So now I will hand it over to Michelle, my coworker.
Thanks, Karen. So my name's Michelle, and I'm the newest ES with the Environmental Compliance Unit at OHV Division Headquarters, and I just want to say I look forward to working with you applicants and grantees moving forward. So I will be presenting on, introducing part 2 of the HMP, and this section of the HMP will be submitted with your final grant applications, and we just wanted to remind you that the deadline for the final applications is going to be Monday, June 5th, so make sure you have that in your calendars. Next slide, please. All right, so as Karen said in her section, if you cannot certify in part 1 and also provide adequate justification that your project does not pose a risk factor to special status species or sensitive habitats, then you're going to need to submit an HMP Part 2. So the HMP Part 2 is broken up into a series of 8 tables, and our team will be providing a brief overview of the contents for each table, as well as some common issues that we see to avoid. And the HMP Part 2 form does provide specific instructions for completing each table, so you're welcome to refer to those or shoot us, any of us staff, a question more specifically if needed. So part 2 begins with these 2 yes or no questions, and that first question there is going to be primarily for nonprofits that use another agency's HMP for their project, and question 2 will become relevant to the first of our tables, which I'll be going over next. Next slide, please. Okay, so table 1 summarizes changes to the HMP. Thus, only applicants who have previously submitted an HMP will need to complete Table 1. This table is going to describe changes to the HMP from within the last year. So this is going to be things like new species that are being monitored or any changes in your monitoring methodology. And HMP Part 2 Table 1 will also list which sections of the HMP that those changes are going to occur in. So a tip for success is that most changes for Table 1 are going to be occurring in Tables 2 through 5 or Sections 2 through 5 of the HMP. So things like annual updates to your monitoring results from Table 6 and management actions in Table 7, those are not going to be considered changes to the HMP itself, and so those don't need to be included in your Table 1. Next slide, please. All right, so here I have some examples of Table 1s pulled from past applicants' HMPs. And in the left-hand columns, you can see the additions and removals of some special status species. And in the right-hand columns, you can see the tables or sections in which these changes occurred. So some of these rows only state Table 2 or Section 2, and in these cases, that's because there was a change to the special status species that could occur within the project's areas and thus be considered for inclusion in the HMP, but those species were not addressed any further in the HMP, hence those changes only occurred within Table 2. But then some of these other rows list that special status species, they list special status species that were considered that they needed to be addressed in the HMP, which is why those list, other tables like Table 3, the Data and Management Program, and Table 4, Summary of the HMP Monitoring Program. So you just want to make sure that that right-hand column does list all sections in which these changes are going to occur from the last year's HMP. Next slide, please. Okay, and here we have some examples of common issues that we see with responses for Table 1. So just remember that Table 1 should list every change from just the previous year's HMP. So we don't need to see any listed changes that are older from within the previous year's HMP. You can go ahead and take those out and just keep it updated with changes from the previous year. And again, things like annual updates to monitoring results or management actions will belong in tables 6 or 7 and don't need to be included in table 1. So all these other tables that I'm mentioning, we're going to be going through them one by one as we go along here. But that's all I have for Table 1, and we'll hear from Shane about Table 2. And if you have any questions for Table 1, go ahead, leave them in the chat, but there will be a built-in break for questions on Tables 1 and 2 after Shane's portion. Thank you.
Perfect. Let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. So greetings, everybody. My name is Shane Emerson. I've been with OHMVR division for about 4.5 years now. I've been an environmental scientist working both within our grants and cooperative agreements and with our state-owned SVRAs with environmental compliance. So first things first, we're going to jump right into Table 2. This is admittedly my personal favorite table for the HMPs. It's basically where you start to build up the foundation of your HMP, and where you can really list out and document all the special status species that could potentially be affected by the project, and that you're able to justify and consider each species on an individual basis. And it really builds foundation for the rest of your HMP moving forward. So it's a very important table. It's a very easy table, though, relative to some of the other ones. But it's definitely your foundational building blocks. So this is a table you want to take your time with and make sure that you're understanding what's going into there and how you're justifying and talking about the different species you'll encounter. Next slide, please. So some things to include for table 2. So specifically, we're targeting those species that are special status, species that you want to make sure you include. For table 2 is you always want to include your federally listed or state listed special status or species. So those that are covered under the Endangered Species Act, both for the federal and state. You also want to add or consider your federal and state candidate species, as well as any species that are proposed for a listing status. Some other species that sometimes get missed or are often included or thought of include your other listed species, other status species, especially within California. You have your fully protected species. This includes stuff like golden eagles, bald eagles, a lot of stuff that's covered under Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and other species that maybe have once been listed and since recovered, but they're still fully protected. Also, species of special concern. The one that comes most often to mind when I hear about a species of special concern is right here in this picture is the Western burrowing owl, which I think a lot of us deal with up and down the state. This is one of the species that commonly pops up for me. And then, of course, your U.S. Forest Service and BLM sensitive and or managed indicator species. Those are species we want to have included within this table. And so a great resource for everybody here, I added it at the bottom, but basically, if you're not sure what the listing status is of a species, and you're not 100%, CDFW has these amazing lists that they keep regularly updated. Usually between every 1 to 3 months, they'll update it, and it includes every sensitive animal within the state that either has a federal, state, or other listing status. And you can easily look these species up on that table. And so it's CDFW's special animal list and CDFW's endangered, threatened, rare plants list. You can easily Google search those and they'll pop up. They're usually number 1 or 2 on your Google search. Next slide, please. So perfect. So here's what table 2 looks like when you're getting into your HMP. There are 5 categories which you have to fill out for each species. First, you want to do the species name. Make sure that with the species, whatever species name you put in here, whether you're using the scientific name or the common name, that you keep it consistent moving forward in the document. So when you go to tables 3, 4, 5, and beyond, you're using that same species name that you're using up here in table 2. Next, you'll fill out the listing status. Some of these species will have multiple statuses. They'll both be federally and state endangered or a state species special concern. Basically, make sure to include all the statuses that you're aware of that this species holds. Next, in the habitat section, you're going to kind of want to just list the standard habitat that the species tends to occupy, and kind of maybe start discussing whether it's present on site or not. And then the potential for the occurrence on site. So maybe the habitat section you leave kind of just describing general habitat traits that the species inhabits. And then for the potential for occurrence, you start talking about the species presence in the area. Has it been documented? Is habitat present or suitable? And then basically what you're going to want to do next is then in the final and most important table is you're going to say yes or no as to whether or not you're going to address this moving forward in your HMP. And so basically if you say, yes, this is a species that's in our area, we know it's going to occur, that's all you have to write is yes. However, if you write no, what you'll have to do is then provide a suitable or adequate justification within this column. And something that I wanted to note to you all, please organize your species in whatever logical manner makes sense to you. We tend to see mostly alphabetized. This can get very confusing for both you guys with filling out your HMP and for us reviewing it. We like to tend to see groupings of similar taxa together. Typically, you put your reptiles with your reptiles, amphibians with your amphibians, birds with your birds. You can also group them by similar habitats. So if you have similar management for those species, you're surveying for them at the same time, or your monitoring is very linked. Keep them together that way is a good way. And always try and group your plants and animals separate. When the plants get mixed in with the animals, it makes it really confusing and a lot more cumbersome in the documents and the tables. So next slide, please. All right, perfect. Yeah, so for each species, state whether to be addressed within the rest of the management. So this is column 5. So if you say yes, you must, in your following tables, which will be discussed by Paula and Megan, the species must be addressed. You only have to put yes for that column, but moving forward in the HMP, you will have to discuss that species. Next slide. So the alternative is this: you say no. You explain basically why not and have to include a strong justification. So that column 5, if you're going to say, no, we don't have to worry about the species, there's no risk factors or potential impacts or for them to be affected by the projects and the project activities, basically then what we're requiring you to do is then provide that suitable justification in that column. I have an example here is basically say vertical fairy shrimp through your database searches with CNDB or IPAC, pull our potential species that pops up. Basically, what you can say is you can go, oh, we have no vernal pool fairy shrimp or vernal pools within this project area. And so OHV recreation is not going to be taking place in or near suitable vernal pool fairy shrimp habitat. And therefore, there's no reason why we need to address this species as part of our HMP. So that's a way of like listing out and getting rid of some of those species that maybe won't be affected by your project. Next slide, please. Perfect. And as with a good justification, I also have to provide some inadequate justifications. So these are some common ones we've seen in the past, and these, I will tell you right now, are not suitable justifications for why a species shouldn't be included as part of your HMP. That it's routine maintenance is a very common one we see. We don't have enough information on species. Species is not high priority. Or it's not threatened or endangered, that these are not suitable justifications. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Perfect. So here's an example of what a good table 2 would look like. So right here we have the Lahontan cutthroat trout, federally threatened, FT, that's what that means. Basically a basic description of what habitats kind of look like. And then the potential for the occurrence of that species within the area. And then obviously describing, yes, we have them in the area. We are going to address them as part of our HMP. Next, we have 2 other species that don't qualify to be addressed by the HMP. The first one is black swift, and the specific justification they give kind of in this green box is that basically the black swifts require rocky cliffs to basically nest and grow and mature, and that none of the project areas around any suitable habitat for these species. So therefore, there's no reason, there's the suitable justification in that the closest nesting site's 5 miles away from the project area, so it won't be impacted. And the same with the Weber's milkvetch is there's basically no suitable habitat to support that plant species, and it hasn't never been observed in the project area. So that's a suitable justification right there. So perfect. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to look into basically your maps of your project areas. These will be submitted with table 2. And maps must show how the project activities related to each species you are going to address are addressed. Basically, we want to see a map of your project area and the species and habitats and where they can occur. relative to your trail and your project area. Be sure that your maps include a north arrow, a scale, and that all species and groups or habitats within your HMP are also included, as well as your relevant OHV trails. Next slide, please. So we what's nice is this is a little small, so we might have to zoom in a little bit, but basically Paula and Megan were nice enough to create a OHV park sensitive species habitat map for you guys as an example. What I like to address and talk to people about with this part is basically these are public documents. And so one thing we want to get across to you guys is not putting the specific breeding locations or habitats, generally keeping it to a habitat area. Just reduces the risk of any illegal poaching or harassment of the animals. We don't want you guys putting where the specific amphibian breeding ponds are at, or where your bald eagles or golden eagles are specifically nesting year in, year out. Generally keep it to a broad open habitat area. So you see like the blue, red, and orange here on this map. It's kind of kept to general areas and there's nothing really specific. And then you can see that the maps and trail for this map, it has a north arrow, the scale bars there, the trails are very clearly defined, and the habitats are kind of mapped out. This is really what we're looking for when it comes to a map from you guys in terms of your project area that is covered by your HMP. And I think that is it for me. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. I'm going to take a drink of water, but are there any questions on tables 1 and 2 and our project area maps?
If anybody has any questions, you can use the raise hand feature and we will call on you. You can also drop any questions into the chat and we will address those.
Also, Debbie, that snowy plover, I saw your comment come up. You guys probably saw me laughing. So those bracelets are actually how we ID the individual. You read them from top left to top right, or bottom right on their little ankles. They have the little beads. And each individual that we tag has its own unique beaded color pattern. So there'll be yellow, blue, blue, yellow, pink, like that's their names for us.
Oh, that's very cool. I've seen pictures typically, maybe have one, two. I had not seen one with 4. I was like, wow, that's very friendly, that one.
They get a 4-color code. It's I think it's because we've tagged so many that we've had to start going to the other foot now too. So
very, very popular. Shane, I'm not showing any hands raised or any questions. So why don't we go ahead and maybe take let's maybe do a 7-minute break. Well, let's come back at 10:47, maybe 10:55. So maybe like about a 7-8 minute break. And maybe we might have some questions. People can process all this information during that time. But everybody, come back at 10:55. Go make yourself some coffee, take a stretch break. But we'll see you back in a few minutes.
Definitely going to be plenty of time for questions. So if you can't think of them now, you can certainly ask them later. And I'll be here all day. Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Shane. Enjoy your break, everybody.
For the rest of this presentation, I'm Paula Hartman with MIG. Been helping out with this program for a couple of decades now. So just appreciate the chance to help out here today. So starting with the table 3, the data and management program. Now that you've worked your way through table 2 and you've come up with your hemp species, it's time to actually start describing your plan. What is your hemp going to look like? So starting with table 3, it details the data and management program for each species. It's about describing what you currently know and how you manage based on that information. For each species, Table 3 describes the occurrence of the species or its habitat in the project area, the methodology that you've used to get that information, your concerns risks or uncertainties about how that species might be affected, your management objectives and management actions, and your success criteria. For table 3, it's okay to group similar species, kind of like what Shane was talking about, how we organize species sometimes. So it's okay in table 3 to group similar species by habitat in this table and in the subsequent tables. So table 2, you had your species row by row, hopefully organized in some logical manner. Once you get into tables 3 and on, you can actually group them if they have some like characteristics. So you might have all your riparian birds together or serpentine plants. Just be sure it's very clear that every yes species in table 2 is clearly listed in table 3 and that your grouping makes sense. So let's talk about these 4 terms that are highlighted in orange. Next slide. Concerns, risks, and uncertainties. Well, we've talked about that a little bit in some of these other tables in the hemp. So let's talk about that more specifically. Like everything in the hemp, concerns, risks, and uncertainties are about your project activities and the associated OHV recreation. So based upon what you know about the species and your project activities, how could each species or group of species be affected? Even if the effect hasn't been observed yet, is it something, though, is it a risk that is possible? Is it something that's concerning to you? So, here's some examples of concerns, risks, or uncertainties. Nest abandonment, crushing of special status plants, or stream bank erosion. Next slide. Management objectives. So based on the concerns you've identified, what are your management goals? Those objectives will direct your management and your monitoring. One thing you might notice here in these examples is that the sample objectives clearly address the sample concerns. So if you're worried about nest abandonment, a logical goal would be to ensure no nest abandonment, or perhaps your special status plants, a logical goal would be to make sure there's no off-trail use that could cause those plants to get crushed. Next slide, please. Management actions. Those describe what you're going to do to meet those objectives. In other words, they should clearly follow from those objectives. There should be a clear flow as you work your way through your hemp. So some management actions might come from documents like an environmental impact statement, or your applicable land management plan, or a biological opinion. Others you might have developed specifically for this project, or for whatever reason has been developed for that particular site. Whatever the source, you want to be sure that your actions are feasible, that they address the objectives, and that always, of course, they should be linked to the project activities and the associated OHV recreation. So I think following through on some of these examples here, these management actions, you can see we were talking about nest abandonment. Here, a management action might be a limited operating period during the nesting season, or those plants that we were worried about getting crushed. Here you see install fencing to keep OHVs on trails. So those seem feasible. Next slide, please. Success criteria. Notice there in italics, specific and measurable. That's really important here. Your success criteria allow you to measure the success of your management actions. They should be clearly linked to those management actions. It's got to be specific and objectively measurable. They can vary in complexity, but think about this. It could be pretty challenging to monitor for nest abandonment. Might be doable, and you can include that. But it could be something perhaps a little more simple if you're monitoring for damaged vegetation in the context of our plants. Success criteria such as no injury or mortality to individuals, they're logical. But it can be really hard sometimes to monitor. So it's important to think about how you're actually going to monitor for certain criteria, and compared to, for an example, no trail widening. And looking at the success criteria you see here, you might see some are more directly attributable to the project, or OHV recreation than others. So, for example, no nest abandonment. This is an area that's very active. Maybe it's got active resource extraction, logging, or mining. You know, might be kind of hard to know whether this nest abandonment is related to your project. So it's just something you want to think about when you're coming up with your success criteria. You know, can you monitor for them? Do they flow logically? Are they feasible? So let's put it all together on the next slide. Here's an example, table 3, and all 7 columns filled out. And we're kind of using the Lahontan cutthroat trout as our sample species as we carry forward here. Beautiful, charismatic species. Anyway, here you can see the known information. It says that there's a trail that's in close proximity to a stream that's known to have cutthroat trout habitat. And you know that from past monitoring. Maybe it was done for a biological assessment, or it was done for your NEPA document. Your concerns are that project activities or OHV recreation could degrade the trout's habitat by altering the stream banks, removing overhanging vegetation, causing sedimentation, or even spreading invasive plants. So your objectives are to prevent that habitat degradation by protecting the stream banks and the riparian vegetation from vehicles, whether recreational vehicles or vehicles that are doing the project activities. Your management actions are to implement best management practices. BMPs, we usually just kind of condense that down to BMPs, to reduce sedimentation and bank erosion where the trail is near the creek. So, for example, here, some of your management actions might be geotextile fabric in your crossings, or water bars to minimize erosion, or barriers, maybe boulders where needed. Your success criteria are that there's no water quality degradation or loss or damage to the creek, to the habitat of the trout, including the riparian vegetation caused by the project activities. You know, even that, thinking about that, those success criteria, it's probably going to be easier here to monitor for vegetation that's been disturbed or lost, perhaps, than it might be to actually measure the sediment load. But actually measuring sediment load could be a success criteria for you. Next slide, please. No, that's it. Any questions on table 3? Any snarky comments on table 3? Okay, anybody out there? I think I need that Bueller slide, Karen.
I am not showing any hands raised.
Did everybody go on break and just stay there? Maybe they're all meeting at Starbucks somewhere down the street, and we should go join them. Okay, well then, if not, that's Shane's here. Good, thank you. I'm glad Shane's here. I guess then we're going to move on. We're going to move on to table 4. It's only 11 o'clock, and I'm not starving, so I guess we're going to keep going. I think we can go on to the next slide.
Yeah, keep going, and then we'll circle back. We'll circle back for lunch around 12.
So let's move on to table 4. So, all righty. So table 4 is the summary of the hemp monitoring program, and it summarizes your program for each species or a group of species. It's actually split into 2 parts. We're going to focus here on table 4A, which describes your 2 types of monitoring. One is effects detection monitoring, and then the other is management action effectiveness monitoring. Table 4A also lists triggers for management actions. And we are going to go over those terms in a moment. Every time you see stuff highlighted in orange, that's usually a clue what we're going to focus in on it. But first, real quickly about table 4B. 4B is for validation monitoring, which describes scientific studies that determine whether your underlying management assumptions are actually correct. So it might refer to a larger population study that helps refine species monitoring and management actions. It's typically validation monitoring is not in a HMP because validation monitoring, those kinds of are usually larger scale studies that are typically beyond the scope of a HMP. But they can certainly be referenced, and they certainly are can be very relevant to your HMP. But it's just typically not something that's included. So if you have questions about that, of course, you know who to contact. You know your grant staff, and they can help guide you as to whether something should or should not be included. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, effects detection monitoring. Now, diving deeper into the contents of 4A, effects detection monitoring is, and by the way, just a quick pause, like I see a lot of comments are happening off in the chat, which is great. I'd love to see the enthusiasm. We will be pausing for questions toward the end, and I don't want to lose track of where I am. So don't worry if you have questions, they're not going to get ignored, but I just, we'll get to them when we get to our Q&A slide. So anyways, effects detection monitoring is qualitative monitoring to detect change caused by project activities or the related OHV recreation. Its purpose is to identify the problems that might be affecting species covered by the HMP. So let's think about our cutthroat trout example. Effects detection monitoring would help determine whether recreation is degrading the trout's habitat by causing erosion or reducing riparian habitat. In that way, if you're monitoring, your effects detection monitoring reveals problems, then your management actions that you've thought of, your management actions you would take to resolve the problem. And remember, you already identified an initial set of management actions back in Table 3. So note that the monitoring documentation method has got to be specified. Are you using checklists? Are you doing photo monitoring? Are you going to have some sort of other reporting? Next slide, please. Management action effectiveness monitoring. So management action effectiveness monitoring kind of brings together your Table 3 management actions, objectives, and your success criteria. It's using your success criteria to determine if your management actions actually achieved your management objectives. So that can include assessing whether those management actions resolve problems that were discovered during effects detection monitoring. For example, did the hardened stream crossing and the fence prevent erosion and protect the riparian vegetation? Effectiveness monitoring must include problems that would trigger management action or change. Those are your triggers that we talked about in the table. Those triggers are typically the conditions about not meeting success criteria. So rather than me blathering on the instructions, let's look at an example on the next slide. Here's an example of Table 4A, and here we have our cutthroat trout. Notice that this particular table also with the trout, we see red-legged frog, and that's because in this example, they share common habitat, risks, and management responses. So that's why it's perfectly logical for them to both show up in the same row of Table 4A. Note that the triggers listed address the concerns. So here we have our trout, and the effects detection methodology involves surveys conducted along this particular trail that's near the trout's habitat. And the surveys will evaluate whether there's any indication of sedimentation, damage to vegetation, eroding stream banks, or invasive plants, that sort of thing. And then notice that it specifically says that they'll use monitoring checklists to document their findings. So it's hit all those points. Here's how we're going to do it, and here's how we're going to record it, and could even report it. The management action effectiveness monitoring, the measures that have been installed, it says the creek crossing measures, they'll be inspected in the middle of the summer, see how they're holding up. Are the criteria being met? Is the geotextile crossing in place, and is the stream bed eroding or not? Are the boulders keeping the OHVs within the designated crossing and out of the riparian vegetation? And the triggers would be, not surprisingly, the evidence of excessive erosion or habitat degradation, maybe riparian vegetation is being damaged, or documented, this one's a little harder to measure, documented injury or mortality of cutthroat trout or red-legged frogs. So that would certainly trigger reevaluation of your management actions or your BMPs. Next slide. We are on to table 5. We will be doing a Q&A for tables 4 and 5 together because they kind of flow together. So moving on to table 5, management, review, and response. Adaptive management. Table 5 captures your management, review, and response to the results of your monitoring. The monitoring that you described in table 4. It's essentially closing the loop for your adaptive management process. It describes how the monitoring data that you gathered via your various monitoring methodologies listed in table 4, how that data will be analyzed and used to inform your management. It also describes your management responses to the identified triggers for the management action or change. Do problems need correcting? Are there other management changes that are needed? So let's follow our trout example on the next slide. Here's an example of table 5. A couple important points to look at least a couple important points. Note that each monitoring methodology in 4A is listed in a separate row here in table 5. Since we had one effects detection monitoring method and one management action effectiveness monitoring method for the trout in 4A, we have 2 rows in table 5. That's an important point that sometimes gets overlooked. Notice also, it's important, it's okay if the management response to the triggers, you're the far right column there, if those management responses are the same for both types of monitoring, that's perfectly okay. You don't have to somehow come up with different management responses. The key is that you've clearly addressed each monitoring method. And probably some of the most common table 5 issues we see are, again, that the monitoring methods that are listed here in table 5 don't match with what's in table 4. And another thing sometimes people get confused on is they try to organize table 5 by species, and it's really organized by monitoring method. So each monitoring method in table 4 gets its own row in table 5. Next slide, we're on to Q&A. I'm looking, there was some movement on the chat happening at the corner of my eye. And do we have any questions? I was trying to look and see if I see. We usually, I see why. So we've got an applicant here, a grantee who is usually fortunate to be able to rely on another grantee. Lucky you, Bruce, you're lucky. That's why you don't have many questions. We'll actually, I think we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Anyway, if we don't have any questions, I guess we'll be moving on to the next slide, or we know Bruce is here. Hopefully the rest of our gang is here too, and I'm going to be turning this over to Megan for table 6, and thank you.
Hello, I'm Megan, as you heard from me briefly earlier, and I am going to cover table 6 through 8 of the HMP, and it looks like we may be finishing by lunchtime. We'll see how many questions and comments we get. And although this is covers tables 6, 7, and 8, a lot of what I'm going to say now is also relevant for the HMP closeout, which I'm going to cover specifically next, but just so you know, it's also related to that, because I know in the survey, some of you were definitely interested in hearing more about the closeout review process. So this is kind of covers both, you know, table 6 through 8 in your final application, as well as the what you'll do for closeout. similar to Table 1, this section of the HMP is only utilized for applicants that have existing HMPs. If it's a new HMP, or let's say you haven't applied for 5 years, then these tables would be blank, or you would just write not applicable. So again, this section has the 3 tables. Table 6 covers the previous year's monitoring results. Table 7 covers the management actions based on those monitoring results. And Table 8 has management actions taken in response to any public concerns that were raised about the HMP. Next slide, please. Okay, so Table 6 once again covers the previous year's monitoring results. The first column of Table 6 should pretty much be almost identical to column 1 of Table 5 from the previous year's HMP. So you want your monitoring results to match pretty much exactly your monitoring methodologies that you had in your Table 5. The next column is going to summarize the results of each monitoring methodology. And finally, you're going to state whether your objectives and success criteria were achieved. And of course, those were laid out in Table 3 of your HMP. Next slide, please. And here is an example of Table 6. This carries forward the haunt and cutthroat trout example that we utilized earlier, that Paula utilized. So again, column 1 of this Table 6 is going to look pretty similar, or pretty much identical to what Paula showed you in column 1 of her Table 5 example. Those same 2 monitoring methodologies for the haunt and cutthroat trout and red-legged frog are listed there. The next column, once again, is going to be the results. So in this particular case, the results, for the most part, showed that the habitat's in good condition, but they did find one area with some erosion and sedimentation. However, their objectives and success criteria in the first row were still achieved, because it looked like the problem could be was being adequately addressed by management actions. So if there is a potential issue, but it's effectively addressed by the management actions, the management objectives and success criteria can still be achieved in those cases. In the second example, the biologist did a follow-up survey of the area where erosion was observed, and they did see that there was some evidence of habitat degradation, or that the BMPs were maybe degrading over time. So in that case, they said no, objectives and success criteria were not achieved, and recommended installing new management actions to address that issue. Now, normally for the same species, you'd probably have either they would achieve the objectives in both rows or not, but for this example's sake, we wanted to show you what happens if you don't achieve your success criteria. And in that case, you would address them with management actions listed in Table 7, which I'll get to soon. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to briefly go over some common issues that I see sometimes in Table 6. And again, this relates to the HMP closeout review as well. If the monitoring methodology in Table 4, which the first table here is Table 4 example, is different from the Table 5 results, that's going to raise a red flag for us. So in this case, their monitoring methodology from Table 5 was annual surveys using the checklist, just as we saw earlier. But in the monitoring accomplishments, it says they use cameras. So that's going to be confusing. Okay, so why didn't you follow your monitoring methodologies that you laid out in your HMP. So make sure those two are consistent. In this case, they are different. Next slide, please. Another thing that sometimes we see is that not all of the monitoring methodologies that were in Table 5 are reflected in the results in Table 6. So for example, if Table 5 had monitoring methodologies for aquatic animals, nesting birds, and plants, we're going to look for those results for those same groups of species. So if we only see monitoring results for aquatic animals and nesting birds, we're going to wonder where are those results for the plants? So that's another issue sometimes that we come across. Next slide, please. Another thing sometimes I see is sometimes grantees that are longstanding applicants will just kind of use their Table 6 as a running list of what's happened over all the years. So you can see in this case in orange, there's multiple years listed. And the problem with this is we want to see whether your objectives and success criteria were met in the past based on work and monitoring from the past year. So this makes it hard to identify what just happened within the previous year. So please limit your Table 6 to just the results from the past year and not multiple years. Next slide, please. And this is kind of just a summary based on those issues I went over. Make sure that column 1 of Table 6 is pretty much just the same as the Table 5 of the previous year's HMP. Make sure that there's a result for each monitoring methodology listed in Table 5 and only include the previous year's monitoring results in the Table 6. Next slide, please. Does anyone have any questions on Table 6? Okay, I guess no questions, so we'll move on to Table 7. Table 7 is the management actions based on monitoring results from Table 6, so it flows directly from Table 6. You'll want to list any management actions that were taken to address issues identified in Table 6 in cases where management objectives or success criteria were not achieved or were only partly achieved. So basically when you say no, they weren't achieved in Table 6 or they were only partly achieved, then you'll want to address those issues in Table 7. The next column will list the habitats and species that the management action is taken to address. And then next, the date that the action is taken or is planned, was taken or is planned. And finally, the last column discusses whether there were any changes needed to the HMP to address the issue that was identified. Next slide, please. So here's an example of Table 7 following through with our same species. For that previous table where they had said no, their objectives were not achieved because they observed some degradation to the trout and red-legged frogs habitat. On the first row there, you can see that they used the BMP, some of the BMPs that were listed in their management actions in Table 3, and that they already completed those in September of 2022. And in this case, no changes were needed to the HMP because they addressed the issue with the existing management actions in their HMP. But for example's sake, let's say that they have noticed that these BMPs over time have failed. So they decided that in the future, it would be best to come up with a long-term solution. In this case, they would plan a bridge at that stream crossing that's been having erosion issues. And again, it addresses the same species. it's planned for the future. And in this case, the new bridge would be a change to the HMP because it's not listed in Table 3 and it's not part of the current management actions within the HMP. It was developed to address this specific issue that arose. So again, at the bottom, that kind of reiterates that the management actions can either be those listed in Table 3, that's column 6, or new management actions can be developed to address a particular issue that was identified during the monitoring. Next slide, please. And again, so I'm going to go over some common issues that come up for Table 7. Sometimes I just see applicants kind of relisting all their management actions from Table 3. And some of these are kind of ongoing actions, and they're not necessarily related to specific issues that were identified during the monitoring in Table 6. So in this example, you can see that the species are California spotted owl, western pond turtle. They're different species than the issue that was identified was for the Lahontan cutthroat trout. So again, this sort of just confuses things when you just list all the management actions, because then we can't really see what specific management actions were used to address that issue that was identified during the monitoring results. So again, just stick strictly to those particular management actions. Next slide, please. And then just like for Table 6, sometimes I see applicants using Table 7 to report actions from multiple years, and we do just want to see only from the previous year, just like Table 6. So again, the multiple years are in orange. Next slide, please. Okay, this is kind of a summary of what I said once again. So only include the management actions that are based on problems identified in your monitoring results where objectives or success criteria weren't fully achieved or were not achieved, and only management actions implemented in the previous year or planned during the previous year based on those monitoring results. Next slide, please. Any questions on Table 7 before I move on to Table 8? Okay, we'll move on to Table 8 then. Table 8 has management actions taken in response to public concerns on the HMP. So it describes the concern that was raised by the public. And then the next column, it describes the actions that were taken in response. These can be public concerns that were raised during the formal public review of the grant application or any informal concerns that were raised with the agency as well. A lot of times there are no concerns that are raised by the public, in which case Table 8 can just state there were no concerns, and that's perfectly fine. I did include an example where there was a concern, just so you can see what that would look like. In this case, someone from the public raised a concern about a bald eagle nest near OHV trails, and the agency took several actions to address that. They put signs up in the area to alert the public of the sensitive resource. They used a limited operating period when necessary, when the nest was active, stepped up law enforcement to patrol the area, and is considering a trail reroute to avoid the nest site. Next slide, please. So finally, I'll go over the Habitat Management Program closeout process. This is when your project is finished and you're closing it out and requesting the final payment is when this occurs. And as I said before, a lot of what I said about table 6 and 7 relates directly to this as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so the closeout review focuses mainly on tables 6 and 7, that covers the project performance period, meaning the time period in which the project work was done. And it's, again, reviewed at the time that the project is being closed out. That HMP closeout approval is needed for the issuance of the final payment, along with the other requirements at that time. And the table 6 and 7 that are submitted for closeout review have to be consistent with the monitoring methodologies that were listed in table 5 of the HMP that was submitted at final application for the project. So for example, if you're closing out a G21 project, table 6 submitted for closeout review has to have results for all the monitoring methodologies from table 5 of the HMP that was submitted for that G21 final application. So when we do the closeout review, we'll look at your HMP submitted at final application for that project, including any revisions that you made based on any clarification memos. And then we'll compare that to your monitoring results submitted for closeout, those table 6 and 7. Next slide, please. So once again, that table 6 and 7 has to cover the right time period for that project. Sometimes I have grantees just resubmit their HMP from their final application. And of course, that doesn't have results for that project. That would have results from an earlier time period. So we need to make sure that it covers the project performance period. So I have a couple of examples for a G21 ground operations project. The application would have been submitted in 2021 and the project would have been implemented in 2022. So therefore, for closeout, we need to review the monitoring results and management actions from 2022. So that again would correspond to table 6 and 7. So now recently restoration projects are also covered under HMPs in some cases, and those are 3-year projects. So for a second example, if there was a restoration application this year in 2023, then the project implementation period would be over a 3-year period from 2024 to 2026. So in that particular case, we would need the monitoring results and management actions for that whole 3-year period to review at closeout. So that's the one exception where table 6 and 7 would cover more than a 1-year period if you're closing out a multi-year project. Next slide, please. So here's some common HMP compliance issues that we notice when we're doing our closeout reviews. If no HMP monitoring is done, or not all the HMP monitoring is done that was listed in that table 5. If no monitoring was done, the HMP will definitely be found non-compliant. If some monitoring was done, it will depend on the particular situation. For example, if only some of the project work was also done and the HMP monitoring is proportional with the project work that was done and covers the project area, the project would likely still be found compliant in that particular case. But there may be other cases where not all the monitoring was done where there could be a compliance issue. So it will be considered depending on the particular circumstance. Next slide, please. Another potential compliance issue is if over multiple years, so we'll look back on past closeouts in some cases to make sure that any past issues with the management objectives and success criteria have been addressed. So if we see that those the same objectives and same success criteria are not met for the same area and the same species, that's another potential issue. Our first step would be to work with the grantee to try to find a solution. And only if the issue still continued, we would report it to the grants management team, and they would consider what to do at that point. But one possibility is that it would be found non-compliant. So if it's a new issue, like a new, let's say you had successfully addressed an issue that was identified in 1 year, and the next year it's a different species, let's say there's an issue with, then that's not a problem as long as the management actions are utilized to address those issues. This is only if it's just the same issue again and again. Next slide, please. So some tips for HMP closeout, just in summary. Again, very important to make sure that all your monitoring results are consistent with that table 5 of your HMP that you submitted with the project at the final application. And make sure that all the monitoring results and management actions are from the right project performance period when the project was implemented. And do reach out to the division in advance if you think you're not going to be able to do all your monitoring, because it's much easier to find a solution that works for both the grantee and the division if we know well in advance if there's going to be a problem. So the first step would be to reach out to your grant administrator. And likewise, if you're having trouble meeting your objectives or success criteria, the division is happy to work with you to try to find a solution. It's a team effort between the division and the grantees, and the division wants the grantees to be successful with their HMPs. Next slide, please. So coming up very soon, we're going to have 2 example HMPs and the HMP template on the division's website. We were hoping to have it done for this workshop, but didn't quite get there. It will be coming very soon. Again, it'll be 2 examples. One will be one that covers the whole, in this case, a forest. Like some grantees will have an HMP that covers their whole agency area. Others will have a much more specific project area. So we have one example of each of those. The examples will be ADA compliant and will include maps, example maps, and there will also be an HMP template provided. Next slide. And that is it. Does anyone have any questions on HMP closeout, or anything else that they want to circle back to is also okay? Someone asked, are the slides from this presentation going to be made available? I'm not totally sure, but I think so. Does someone from the division know the answer to that?
They are going to be available. That is something we can. Last time we emailed them out. It took a day or 2 after the workshop to send those out. This training is also being recorded, so we plan to have it posted to our website in a couple weeks. So if you missed something, or if you have any new staff, this resource will be available on our resources tab for you to go back and watch again.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Are there any more questions or topics that people would like to discuss? I know we're finishing much earlier than we planned. So again, there's plenty of time if anyone has something else they want to bring up or discuss. If not, we'll just have a very early finish, I suppose. Give maybe people one more minute to think of any questions they might have.
I also just dropped the survey link. If you guys could take a minute before you leave today to fill out that survey link is in the chat. It will come out via email, but it is in the chat right now. It'll take about 2 minutes. It's quick, I promise.
Okay, and I just saw a comment in the chat from Bruce that says it can be hard for under-resourced agencies to prepare the HMP. And we do understand that. And my understanding is that you can apply for funds for during your grant application that can cover some of those costs of preparing and implementing the HMP. You can include it in your grant application funding request. And then aside from that, if there's no other questions or comments, I believe, is it John that's closing us out, or was that you, Deborah?
John and myself.
Don't have the staff. Okay.
Looks like there might be one more comment that just came in.
Yes, I think Bruce said that the issue wasn't funding, the issue was a shortage of staff. I can tell you that the division's been very proactive in working with grantees to help them finish their HMPs and has been flexible about giving them extra time to complete them when needed. So there is that. Aside from that, I know the staffing issue can be sort of an ongoing issue for some of the agencies. So I acknowledge that. I don't know if someone from the division has anything to add to that.
No, you're right on with that. I know with the additional time that we've allotted for grantees to get the appropriate paperwork and make those changes in. So although we like to have it perfect the first time, we understand that's not always the case. And so we do want you to get that funding. So we are willing to work with you within a reasonable amount of time to get that.
And this is Sixto. One of the things I've seen is some of the agencies start actually hiring or using funds to hire resources folks to help with the environmental requirements. Obviously, they still have to work with the agency, the land manager, to get things approved and stuff. But that's one of the things I've seen is just some of the non-public land managers hire their own staffing.
Looks like there are some other comments. Like Jessica, grantees hiring contractors to do the work, as Sixto said, and then outsourcing the HMPs to private contractors, but the agency still has difficulty approving work done by others. So good comments. Anything else before we close out the workshop? Okay. Well, that's everything. That concludes our workshop. Thanks for everyone for attending and for the presenters. I know State Parks and MIG staff have been working hard on this workshop, so thank you very much. Not a lot of questions today, but some good discussion. I imagine as people start working on their HMPs, there will be more questions. So just a reminder, please reach out to Megan, Karen, Shane, Michelle, and the grant administrators to have any questions you may have. So with that, thank you all again and have a good afternoon. And I'll pass it over to Debbie.
All right, thanks, John. I just want to real quick before everybody takes off, I just want to talk about some future classes we have. Obviously, today we did our HMP. Tomorrow we will be having our soil compliance workshop. That's from 9:30 to 12. If you haven't registered for that and you want to attend, go ahead, shoot me an email or your grant administrator email, and we will get you the link to register for that. Upcoming in June, roughly June 2nd, we're going to have a couple pre-recorded training sessions. That's going to be on how to fill out those project accomplishments reports. Those are the PARs, and they will be on our website under our resources tab. Then we are back live on August 23rd for the project agreement process. November 9th, we're going to do a payment request for BLMs on how to fill out those BLM specific payment requests. And then on November 16th, we will have a payment request for advances targeted for nonprofits. So again, this schedule is up on our resources tab. Thank you all for coming today. We hope you have a great rest of your day. And let us know if you have any questions. That survey is in the chat. It will go out to make sure that you guys fill that out. Have a great day, everybody.
And last thing, Amanda, if you can go to the next page, this has the contact information. So there's the contact information. Please write it down, write down the emails, take a picture of the screen, and definitely let us know if you have questions.